Welcome to Muslim Apologetics Australia. This is part 2 of my video responding to Surah 434 and the allegations raised against Hizbu Tahrih and the two women who were interpreting the Quran, the Muslim women, and they exactly showed the true interpretation that the beating is only meant to be symbolic and it was only meant to be a tap. And of course, the Islamophobes did not want to hear this interpretation, and they raised several more questions and assertions. And basically, this video is a counter rebuttal to those assertions and claims. So I'll run through the questions. By the way, if you haven't seen part 1, please go and watch it so you understand the full context. Where we present the case defending Hizbu Tahrih and their claim on Surah 434. And God willing, once you go through that and through the debate which I had with Nick McCallum and debunked and destroyed him, many of the critics came and saw the video and they raised more questions on the subject. And in this discussion, I'll expose their questions and again deal with it and refute it by the permission of God. So here is a non-Muslim, Frankie D. Choki, what is his name, just in the text. He says, quote, "When the Quran said beat them, it meant beat them. The so-called symbolic beat them is a later interpretation. Who can you beat someone without hurting them?" He says, how can you beat someone without hurting them? How is tapping someone on the shoulder the same as hitting them? Is there no word or expression in Arabic for tapping or them on their shoulders? He says there is, so why the Quran doesn't use the word? So he's saying why the Quran doesn't actually use the specific word tapping. He says the contest on the verse is before the coming of the verse. Arabic tribes used to kill or bury alive their women who disobeyed them, so the verse was an improvement over the existing practices of disciplining women. It's time that we Muslims, the Muslims, stop with the lies and admit the truth and tell the context to the people. And I said to him in response, I said, and this is my response to him, I said, you clearly have no idea what you're talking about, and in fact you've borrowed lies from fake imam called Sheikh Tawhidi, who lied about Surah 434 being in relation to people bearing daughters and wives, so that verse 434 was revealed to give a less of a punishment. This is nonsense, and the pagans burying people did not include burying wives. That was specific to burying their infant daughters. The symbolic interpretation is not a new interpretation, because the earliest scholar known as Ibn Abbas narrated that the verse in question, Surah 434, is to be conducting a beating that is non-violent. Thus, any non-violent beating can only be a tap that causes zero pain, period. The Arabic word idrubuna is translated into beat. The term beat can mean beating something extremely lightly, like tapping a drum. Thus, it's a symbolic form of beating something hard. The non-Muslim wrote, can you provide the reference that shows that the Prophet interpretation of the verse? Show one hadith that speaks to the Prophet saying it means like a light touch. He then says, beat them or separate them is in a suspension of the sexual relations fails to work, and it suggests that men use darb. This word is almost universal and translated as beating. Such a translation is supported by some other passages, and he quotes them. He says it is used also as to separate between two groups, hereafter leaving, withdrawing, taking, and meaning, separating truth from falsehood. And he continues on by saying, in the present of the context, the Quranic usage allows two meanings: separating from wives or meaning, which is have sex with them. The first meaning fits the context well. He then goes on to say, he then says the second step, meaning beating, meaning is more natural from a linguistic point of view and has the support of strong consensus among the commentators. He then says the third meaning has no support in the Quranic usage. I agree about separation. He then says, in this connection, it must be immediately noted that there is no warrant here in this verse for wife battering. The suggestion is to use a beating is made specific with nuzjurs on the part of the wife, that is to deal with her deliberately nasty behavior that possesses a threat to the marriage. Beating is to be done after due admonishment and suspension of sexual relations, and therefore by husbands who have some moral standards and have sufficient control over their sexual passions. Moreover, this beating is not to go on but is to be tried as last step to save the marriage. Yes, that it is not working, it is to be abandoned in favor of some other steps involving relations of husband and wife mentioned in the text, verse 435. There is therefore absolutely no license here for the type of regular and continual wife beating that goes on in some homes, where each time the husband is angry with his wife or with someone else, he turns against her and beats her up. And of course, he brings another narration where there are differences of opinion between commentators. Some say that you can, like Book al-Tabari, you can beat with a folded scarf, and as the women have demonstrated in the video. So my basic response to him is, you basically defeated your own argument, as beating as understood by Tabari says, hit with a folded scarf. So it's with any object that gives no bodily harm. As we have shown, Tafsir ibn Kathir, Ibn Abbas, the greatest classical scholars, said, the beating has to be non-violent. Is there anything such as this? Yes, when the beating becomes so insignificant to a level, it becomes a tap or a pat. You then argued, why would you tap a person? What is that resolve? Because that's what he basically said. What's it going to resolve? So he's basically saying that it has to be a harsh disciplinary matter that it came to the first. And what is a tap going to resolve? My answer is, I've addressed it. It is not supposed to do upset in a symbolic way. So first step isn't a discipline, second step isn't a discipline. It's just to express your anger. It's not like you're trying to discipline a dog. And he basically said in response, and before we go that, there is a hadith, and I'll post it below this video, where there's commentators and people who have said that it's not supposed to cause any pain, and it's not supposed to leave any marks, and you're supposed to forbid from hitting the face and things like this. Look at point 4, where he mentions, if a man admonishes his wife, this is what the non-Muslim is saying, he's basically disagreeing, because he's saying that all three steps, the later step has to be always more severe than the first step, because why would it come to the third step, right? So he's basically saying, if a man as his wife or her wrongdoing and she still continues, he separates himself from her and she still continues her wrongdoings. By he tapping her on the shoulder, will that change her wrongdoing, or is that action stronger or more severe than the first two steps, such as abandoning the bed and not speaking to her and things like that? He then goes on to say, remember, these three steps need to go in order of severity. Admonishment is the first step, separation is the second step, beating is the third and final correction step. But if the beating is just a tap or a tap on the shoulder, then it's less severe than separation from her. He then goes on to say, because I brought up, being spanked in the Western world, he tries to address that too. He says, beating being non-violent can refer to the beating or spanking parents give to their children. No one considers normal spanking parents give to children are violent in conduct. So the term non-violent can mean many things, but what is the form of beating? Now the question is, should we be spanking our women for wrongdoing? So basically he's saying that spanking children is not done in a violent fashion, and but we're still spanking them, and he's saying, should that be acceptable for adult women? So we'll address both of those questions, God willing. I basically said to him, the Prophet said that beating can't leave a mark or cause a pain. This is through the hadiths and the interpretation of tafsir. So if you suggest that beating as a last resort needs to discipline her, then that requires a mark or a pain. Can you now deal with how are you going to discipline without pain or a mark left? Go ahead, entertain us. The 3 stages are just warning signs of exhausting all avenues, symbolically period, because the 4th step is actually divorce. And that's not part of discipline now, is it? You're just basically leaving her. And I said to him, so you think in your mind that the non-violent spanking we do with our children is going to work with women being scared not to cross the line? Your wife will actually laugh at you if you try to admonish children the same way you'd admonish your wife. See how your logic doesn't work when thinking the Quran was meant to discipline women with a light smack. Doesn't work either way, for why? It's all a symbolic demonstration of expressing anger. It's never meant to be done in a real violent way, nor in a way you smack your children, because that's pointless with adults. Children are sensitive, they get scared on a very light smack and cry even though we don't give them pain on the bottom. If you tried the same method on an adult, he would laugh at you, or might even get excited like spanking them during sex. I'm just using that as humor. The context of the verses in the 3 stages is not to go from one severity to another severity. Rather, it is just to go through stages so it can give the wife time to think about some of her wrongdoings, just to as like a cool-off period. It's not as to go from one severity to another severity in physical and mental and psychological harm. Another anti-Muslim actually posted how, even lightly touching your spouse, like tapping her, and we'll give a demonstration of that. Okay, so this is a demonstration. She's holding a siwak, it's like a toothbrush in her hand, and this is what we mean by a tap. Okay, so this is what it looks like when the Quran says beats. So let's have a look.
It's a stick. It's a small stick. Used for cleaning the teeth. May I have the honor? Of course, yes.
There you go. Did you see that? He just tapped her. That was all that was done in this. Okay, so let's watch it again.
Actually, I got a siwak, because I wanted to show what siwak is. It's a stick. It's a small stick.
Okay, watch how she's going to just tap her with the small stick. Watch this.
Used for cleaning the teeth. May I have the honor? Of course, yes. And,
So that's what it is. Now, an Islamophobe still had a problem with this and said, according to the Australian laws, you can still be charged just by simply tapping a person. And in this case, this is your spouse. It's not a stranger. It's not someone in the street. You're not going to a police officer and tapping them. This is basically your wife, the one that you love and you live with. Okay? And you're basically tapping her with the stick, a very small toothbrush, which is quite ticklish if you ask me. So you're basically just tapping her. Now, some Islamophobes think that this is problematic and this can actually constitute a criminal offence. Sandra Groves says, this is derived from the definition of assault, because I asked her, I said, I challenge you, bring me something from the Australian law. And she basically clicked this. Okay, she posts from Section 20 of the Criminal Law, Constitution Act 1935, South Australia, that outlines the offence of assault. And it says, assault occurs if there is any intentional and unwanted physical force used against a victim, and for example, punching, hitting, or kicking a person. The force used can be direct or indirect. For example, because of an assault, a person drops a child they were carrying. That is also assault on the child. And then it says, assault also occurs if there is any intentional and unwanted direct or indirect contact on another person, however slight the contact may be. They go on to say, assault can occur even without physical contact. So this could be if a threat is made to apply force and victim reasonably believes that the person can carry out the threat or mere real possibilities. So notice they actually conflate this and say, look, this applies to Islam, therefore Islam is guilty through even Australian criminality court system. However, the simple reply to this is there is no physical force applied when you're actually tapping a person. As we saw in that video demonstration, there was no kicking, no punching, and no hitting. Not even a heavy newspaper is thrown at a person, because that's what the court jurisdiction says, like throwing a heavy newspaper at a person. And I'll post that as well. Like I said, a woman would never complain to law enforcement if her husband tap, as put forward in the video that we watched. There has never been in Australia. The law you brought up is very vague and says nothing about a being tapped. Unless you can show anything specific, you have no argument. And this is a definition of a hit, right? It says bring one's hand or tool or weapon into contact with someone or something quickly and forcefully. This is equivalent to strike, slap, smack, cuff, punch, beat, thrash, thump, batter, pepper, drop, hook, pound, smash, slam, welt, pumble, hammer, bang, knock, swat, whip, flog, cane, sucker, punch, rain, blows, and give someone a good beating. So notice you don't really have like tapping in there in that definition, or patting. And now let's look at the definition of tap or pat. It says touch quickly and gently with flat of the hand. He patted him, synonymous with tap. Slap, lightly, stab. So as you can see, it's just a light tap and it's not anything equivalent to beat. Now, of course, the Arabic word idrubuna or daraba is actually translated into beat, because that's the translator's choice. But of course, he could have chosen the word a tap or pat in that case. So basically, you know, when you're trying to conflate a misinterpretation or mistranslation or choice of word error, and then try and conflate that to the English dictionary and say, look, it means hit or it means beat, that is a wrong equivocation fallacy. Basically, you need to, we could bring up the word pat or tap, and it would just be, and use that with the English definition. Of course, they could refute their claims, and of course be consistent with, again, the Arabic translation for idrubuna or daraba. As you can see, there is a distinction. The Quran interpretation is to tap or pat and not hit. Therefore, you need to bring a law that explicitly says it's a crime to tap a person outside of being violent. There is a difference between a violent tap and a non-violent tap. The Quran expresses a non-violent tap because Ibn Abbas said that the hit must be non-violent. He was a companion of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So basically, Sandra came back and said, what part of however slight the contact can be don't you understand? Okay, so she's basically saying, referring us back to the law, which the law says, however slight the contact can be, which can still be a crime. And she says it doesn't have to be hitting, it can be any kind of touch or even a threat or touch. She says solicitors do not use ordinary dictionaries, by the way. They use legal dictionaries to define terms, and legislation also usually defines terms used. The Quran says to beat. It is interpretation using other hadith that leads to the conclusion that this should be light beating. But in Western country, any kind of beating or threat or beating or symbolic beating or standing over a woman is considered violence. Symbolic beating. Amazing. It is said that an Arab woman thinks she has to put up with that, and some do, but not all. They don't have to. In Australia, they would. Anyway, you get her response. So here is the response to her diatribe. I said to her in response, I said, are you saying merely touching your wife can be a criminal offense while you're married to her and you have touched her not in a hurtful way? Are you that idiotic? Please get me one single court order case where a man touched his wife and he has been prosecuted. Just bring me one case. This is getting absolutely laughable. And I said, wrong. The Quran means light tapping. It's not a light beating. The Quran translator used the word beat, but he could have used the word light tap. Therefore, imposing the word beat into the Arabic word daraba or idrubuna is incorrect. One can also translate it to be tap or pat. Sandra comes back and says, no, obviously affectionate touching between husband and wife which is mutually considered is far from a crime. You have been shown and told the laws. Ignorance of the law is no defense. Why do you think so many people are upset? Because they know it to be wrong. It is a form of domestic violence. I'm tired of explaining basic human rights that any decent person should know. Even within Sharia, it may be considered permissible, but not encouraged. So why advocate it? So my response to her is, sorry dear, agreeing to the Quran between husband and wife's commandment is part of mutual agreement, and she has accepted the Quran to allow a husband to touch her using a tap. Thus it's part of mutual agreement. Like I said, I have never heard of a woman press charges on her hubby just for mere touching her with a tap that is non-violent and that caused no bodily harm. Therefore, your assertion of it being a criminal act has no value whatsoever. Yes, you are tired because you can't even point to a single prosecution case where a man was simply convicted for touching his wife with a tap on the shoulder. No wife would ever prosecute such a husband. In fact, it's laughable because it has never once caused her pain or injury. Period. Thus, the Quran text, as demonstrated by the women in the video, was to demonstrate a symbolic tapping, but desperate people wish to think otherwise and then bring secular law into it, then jump into hasty conclusions about it being human right abuses as if it wasn't mutual and so forth. The women in Islam agreed to live under the Quranic law, which actually deals with moral issues between husband and wife, so they've accepted men to actually tap them without any physical hurt or violence. Thus, it is part of their mutual agreement. So, if it's not part of their mutual agreement, then she wouldn't marry a Muslim man. Now, would she? She signed the contract to marry a Muslim man, right? So that is part of it being mutual. Extremely desperate, these people. In part one of the video, it was my debate with mccallum, and I used the AFL football hip and shoulder, where in certain sports you can actually do contact sports and hit people and so forth, like hit them to the ground. And I gave many other examples, but another Islamophobe tried to pick on that, and he gave a response such as, he said, and watch part one so you can actually understand it. He says, He says, he told me that I actually got owned. He says, you got owned on the radio interview. You came across like a rapid nutter who had no idea of the point that Nick McCallum was trying to make. Firstly, you can't compare hard contact in contact sport on a AFL football field, which is acceptable part of the game, to what is being discussed. False equivalence. He says also you should be made aware of what constitutes assault under Australian law. If you walk up to someone and tap them with your pinky finger in the gentlest of pokes, that invasion of personal space could be considered assault. It may not cause damage or bodily harm, but it is still assault under the law. He says, so that makes any Islamic provision for a small stick or whatever utensil the husband uses without harm and an assault weapon at the husband's engagement of the act of an assault. And of course, the Islamophobes always make the argument, how come the woman can't discipline the men when she's displeased with you and smack you and so forth? Why is the husband that does this? We'll address that too. My response to Jay Moore is, yes, I got owned. I expect an Islamophobe to admit a Muslim won the debate. Quite cute. Still didn't get why I brought up the AFL tackle. Please, God, give this guy a brain. Did you hear that? I said to Nick that I wasn't comparing the situation, and I understand one is a sport regarding the AFL tackle, the hip and shoulder in sport to the ground. I said, but I was merely comparing there are far more violent things acceptable in society, Western society, that is much more violent than the tapping. It seems you clearly have a listening comprehension disorder. You also conveniently ignored how I also brought up toddlers of young children being spanked by parents in the whole debate, in which case Nick said we shouldn't be comparing two adults to children. When Nick kept shifting the goalposts as if it was somehow okay in his world to smack children, in my discussion I also brought up the fact that Australian police officers also kicks batons to hit people in crowd control, while Nick was talking over me. Because he got finally debunked and realized he no longer can make excuses, proving that even adults hit one another for disciplinary purposes. And again, I'm not comparing either scenarios because they all may be different in context, rather expressing that in Australian culture there are certain justifications for beating people. Whereas in Islam, the hitting of women is not a beat. Rather, it's just a tap. Then you gave a false equivocation example by poking people with a sharp finger in public like strangers. Firstly, they are the public and not your wife, so it's a bad comparison. Secondly, the Quran doesn't teach you poke your wife, which can be sharpful and painful, which could cause pain. We should instead compare a tap. I have never heard in my entire life where an Australian law says if you went into the private space of a stranger and tapped them on the shoulder and asked for directions, you're going to get charged. Please send me a copy of the Australian law where it specifically states in domestic disputes simply tapping your wife on the shoulder, telling her to be quiet or telling her to listen to you convicts a person of a crime. I mean, it's just laughable, honestly. Here's a response to, disciplinary actions and things like that. We can actually see the hadith in Al-Tirmidhi. It says, treat women kindly. It says, you have rights over your wives, and they have, listen to this bit, they have rights over you. Your right is that they shall not permit anyone you dislike to enter your home, and their right is that you should treat them well. So the women actually have rights over you, that you should treat them well. So when you say, where is the rights of women? How come the women can't, discipline men? Well, they can, because the hadith says the men have to treat them well. So the woman could mentally discipline the man and say, you have to treat me well, because that's what the hadith, that's what the Prophet ﷺ said. This is in Sahih al-Tirmidhi, volume 1, book 7, hadith 1163. Have a look at this in Sunan Ibn Majah, volume 3, book 13, hadith 2334. We see even Aisha radiallahu anha, who actually striked the Prophet Muhammad's hand. It says, it was narrated that Anas bin Malik said, the Prophet was with one of the mothers of the believers, his wives, and another wife sent a bowl containing food. She, the first wife, struck the hand of the messenger and the bowl fell and broke. The messenger of Allah took the two pieces and put them back together. Then he started gathering up the food and putting it in the bowl. He said, your mother was jealous. Eat. So basically, notice that it wasn't a big deal that if they struck one another, tapped one another, and things fell to the ground. They didn't make a big deal of it. So the men did it to women, women did it to men, but it was never seen as physical abuse, right? And the Islamophobes want to make something out of it, like men have power over women, when even the hadith and the text, it shows that women are having power over, right? So that clearly debunks their position to say it's one-way traffic. And of course, again, none of the texts of the Quran actually even demean the verses to even mean this graphic. Like I said, it's a clear-cut tap, pat, and it's not a physical hit and abuse. Of course, we can quote all these other verses where the Prophet Muhammad said, the best of you are the best to your wives, and treat women with kindness. I'll put a hyperlink below this video and you can read all of the hadiths. I'm not going to take space in this video and keep quoting all the hadiths. So again, it clearly contradicts the Islamophobic position. And the Prophet Muhammad, the best role model, he never again hit his wives. So that clearly debunks their position. And like I said, all these Islamophobes say you don't have to touch a person to physically harm them and bring a criminal offense against them. I agree, you can make threats and you can do other things. However, in the context of between a man and a wife, we ask the Islamophobes, give us a single reference in the exact context that I've mentioned, where a man is trying to resort and save his marriage, and he goes through the 3 stages, and at the end, he symbolically, all he does is tap them, and she agrees mutually that the Quran actually allows that to happen, so she's also agreed to that condition, and mutually she allows him tapped, for her to be tapped, and you need to now give us a case where the Australian Constitution steps in and says that's a criminal act. In that context, you will never find a law. You will never find a law to prosecute it. And I challenge any Islamophobe to bring that exact context and see if a prosecution can be laid. And it can't. And in fact, if that is the case, then I urge and tell any Islamophobe to bring me any jurisdiction or prosecution case that has been taken place in that exact context where a woman has agreed in a mutual way to the verse of the Quran which allows the husband to give her a tap, and then through that agreement she has still prosecuted him and it's gone to court and he was prosecuted and he was found guilty. You will not find that in a jurisdiction court, nor would you find that in the case of non-Muslims. So it's clear that they are desperate in their claims to bring secular law to try and put judgments on this particular scenario and say that it's a crime in Western society when they are doing false equivocations and they're not presenting the context to judge it by secular jurisdiction. I'll last and but least leave you with this. These are Australian police. You know, they all these Westerners want to act like they're just moral they have a problem when the Quran says you can tap your wife in the softest, which she actually accepts, like you're just tapping her on the shoulder, as the women presented in the video. You know, these Westerners want to act on this moral ground. Oh, look, you know, look at Islam, look at Muslims. Oh, they have a problem with tapping, even though it's just symbolic. Yet look at their own Australian police officers, how they actually carry batons and beat people who are disobedient and cross the line. Now, again, I'm not trying to compare the beating in Islam and say, look, West beats people, therefore Islam can beat people. I'm not using it just before an Islamophobe runs his mouth loud and says, oh, look, he's comparing it to law enforcement, and look, he's trying to justify beating of women. I'm not. I'm just showing you that the beating in Islam is only symbolic, and you're not allowed to do any bodily harm or physically hurt them, and the women in the video demonstrated that. Now you will actually see instead where physical force is used by police officers. Have a look.
Witnesses described it as a sickening attack. Baton drawn, the officer hits one man twice, then strikes the other 3 times. It was just before 2:30 in Whitmore Square. Onlookers couldn't believe their eyes.
And he comes out with his baton.
Let's have a look again.
And he comes out with his baton, pepper spray.
Witnesses described it as a sickening attack. Baton drawn, the officer hits one man twice, then strikes the other 3 times.
So, of course, police officers do that. It's okay. Why? Because it's law enforcement, because secular law says, oh, they're just police officers. So what gives them the moral right? So if secular law gives moral right to police officers, and you want to accept this as justification and it's not abuse anymore, but then when the Quran lays out a foundation where you're only supposed to symbolically tap your wife, it becomes a problem now, does it? So you give your justification and say, oh, well, that's police officers, that's law enforcement. But then when we say that's God and that's his legislation, then you have a problem with it. So you call one abuse while you don't call the other one abuse. So notice double standards and the inconsistencies in their silly, pathetic arguments. And I know what some Islamophobes will do. They'll say, oh, these police officers acted in the wrong way. They weren't supposed to really baton these people that way. Well, excuse me, why are they carrying batons in the first place? They are carrying batons in the first place because they are allowed to beat people, and they are allowed to also electrocute, taser people. So where is the inconsistency there?